Leningrad, December 1st, 1934. It is late afternoon in the Smolny Institute, the historic building in Leningrad that has served as a center of political power since the October Revolution of 1917, the place where the Bolsheviks established their revolutionary headquarters in the days when history was being made in this city. The corridors are quiet in the way that large institutional buildings become quiet in the late afternoon, when the day's formal business is winding down and the people who work here are moving toward the end of their routines. Sergei Mironovich Kirov, the first secretary of the Leningrad Party organization, one of the most powerful figures in the Soviet Union, a full member of the Politburo, and the man whom many observers of the Soviet system consider to be among the 2 or 3 most significant political figures in the country after Stalin himself, is walking through the corridor of the 3rd floor toward his office. Behind him, a man named Leonid Nikolaev is walking in the same corridor. Nikolaev is carrying a revolver. He has been in the building before, attempting access on previous occasions, turned away each time. Today, for reasons that will become one of the most debated questions in Soviet historical scholarship, he is not turned away. He is in the building, in the corridor, close enough to the man he has come to kill. At approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, Nikolaev fires. The bullet enters Kirov's skull from behind. Kirov falls. He dies almost immediately, or within minutes, without regaining consciousness. Within hours, Stalin is informed. Within days, Stalin is in Leningrad, personally overseeing the investigation. Within weeks, new laws are passed, accelerating the processing of political cases and enabling executions without appeal. Within months, the arrests have begun in the wave that will eventually become the Great Terror, the most comprehensive political massacre in Soviet history. One shot in a corridor. Hundreds of thousands of executions to follow. The question that has occupied historians for nearly a century is whether these 2 facts are connected in the way that the most disturbing interpretation suggests. Not simply that Kirov's murder provided the pretext for the terror, but that the murder was arranged by the same person who most benefited from it, the man who arrived in Leningrad within hours to personally take control of the investigation, the man whose political position was most strengthened by Kirov's death. That man is Stalin. This is the story of Sergei Kirov, of what his rise and his murder tell us about the Soviet system that produced both, and of the question that his death has never fully answered. Sergei Kirov was born Sergei Mironovich Kostrikov on March 27, 1886, in Urzhum, a small town in Vyatka province in central Russia. His origins were difficult even by the modest standards of provincial Russian working-class life. His father abandoned the family when Sergei was young. His mother died when he was 7, and he and his sisters were raised in a charitable institution, an orphanage, essentially, that provided the basic education and maintenance that the absence of family resources required. The circumstances of his childhood, the poverty, the institutional upbringing, the early encounter with the indifference of a social system to the needs of children without resources, were the kind of formative experiences that the revolutionary movement could transmute into political commitment. He was a bright student, received a technical education, and encountered the revolutionary movement in its various forms as a young man in the ferment of early 20th century Russia. He joined the Bolsheviks in 1904 at the age of 18, making the political commitment that would define his entire subsequent existence. His early party work was in the Caucasus region, in the cities and towns of the Transcaucasia, where the complex ethnic and political landscape of the Russian imperial borderlands created both opportunities and challenges for revolutionary organizing. He was arrested multiple times, spent time in Tsarist prison, and built the specific combination of organizational experience and personal toughness that the underground revolutionary movement required of its activists. His work in the Caucasus brought him into contact with other Bolsheviks operating in that region, among them the man who was then known as Koba and who would later take the name Stalin. The Caucasus was Stalin's home territory, the region where he had built his early revolutionary career, and the Bolshevik networks of the area were ones in which both men operated. The relationship that developed between them in this period was not yet the relationship of senior leader and subordinate that it would later become. They were comrades in the same regional revolutionary network, building the foundations of what would eventually become something much more complex. Kirov's wartime and Civil War career established him as one of the most capable military and political organizers in the Bolshevik movement. He played a significant role in the military campaigns in the Caucasus during the Civil War, working to establish Soviet power in the region against the resistance of the multiple armed forces that were contesting control of the area. His organizational abilities, his personal courage, and his effectiveness in building political support in difficult conditions distinguished him from the mass of party workers and brought him to the attention of the Central Party leadership. His appointment as first secretary of the Leningrad Party organization in 1926 was the turning point of his career. Leningrad, the former imperial capital, the city of the October Revolution, was the second city of the Soviet Union, a major industrial center, and the base of what had been the Zinovьevite political network that had recently been defeated in the succession struggle. Taking over the Leningrad organization required both organizational skill and political sensitivity, the ability to build a new political base while managing the residual loyalties and resentments of an organization that had just been through a significant political upheaval. Kirov accomplished this with notable effectiveness. He built a Leningrad Party organization that was genuinely loyal to him personally and to the Stalin-led Central Party leadership, transforming what had been a potential center of opposition into one of the most reliably Stalinist regional organizations in the country. His management of this transformation demonstrated the specific combination of organizational ability and personal charisma that distinguished him from most of his colleagues in the Soviet leadership. His relationship with Stalin deepened through the late 1920s and into the 1930s, developing into what observers described as genuine personal warmth alongside the institutional relationship of regional boss and central leader. Stalin's relationships were generally characterized by the power differential that his position created, but the specific quality of his connection to Kirov involved elements that went beyond pure institutional hierarchy. They hunted together, vacationed together, spent time in each other's company in the informal contexts that were not simply extensions of political work. Stalin called Kirov by the affectionate diminutive Mironik, a form of address that in Russian indicates personal closeness rather than formal relationship. Kirov was among the small number of people whom Stalin treated with the specific warmth that his generally suspicious and controlling character permitted him to extend to anyone. This warmth was genuine in the sense that Stalin's behavior toward Kirov differed from his behavior toward most of his other colleagues, more relaxed, more direct, more suggestive of actual personal regard. Kirov's rise within the Soviet leadership through the early 1930s placed him in the Politburo as a full member, in the innermost circle of Soviet political decision-making, and in a position from which his views on party policy carried genuine weight. He was involved in the major political decisions of the period, participated in the Politburo's deliberations, and expressed views on policy questions that were not simply echoes of Stalin's positions, but reflected his own assessments of what the party needed to do. The early 1930s were years of extraordinary violence and upheaval in the Soviet Union, driven primarily by the forced collectivization of agriculture and the crash industrialization of the first five-year plan. The collectivization campaign, which involved the coercive seizure of agricultural land and the destruction of the kulak class of wealthier peasants through arrest, deportation, and execution, produced a famine in 1932 and 1933 that killed millions of people in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and other regions. Kirov's response to these events is documented in ways that suggest his views were more moderate than the most extreme position within the party leadership. He was involved in discussions about the pace and methods of collectivization and industrialization, and the documentary record indicates that he was among those in the leadership who expressed concern about the human costs of the policies being pursued. Whether this represented a genuine and sustained alternative political position or a tactical moderation within the framework of overall support for Stalin's direction is a question that historians have assessed differently. The 17th Party Congress of January and February 1934, sometimes called the Congress of Victors for the celebration of socialist construction that was its official tone, is the political event most directly relevant to understanding Kirov's position in the Soviet hierarchy and the circumstances that preceded his murder. The Congress of Victors was the first major party congress since the most extreme phases of collectivization and the famine, and its tone of celebration reflected the official determination to present the five-year plan's achievements as evidence of socialist construction's success. But underneath the official celebration, there were political currents that the available historical evidence, including testimony from delegates and from NKVD investigations conducted after 1934, allows partial access to. The most significant of these currents, and the one most directly relevant to Kirov's subsequent fate, concerns the question of the party leadership, and specifically the question of Stalin's continuation as General Secretary. The historical evidence on this question is contested and incomplete, but several sources indicate that at the 17th Congress there was discussion among some delegates about whether a change in the top party leadership might be desirable, with Kirov's name mentioned in connection with this discussion. The specific story, documented in testimony from several former party members and officials, including Anastas Mikoyan and others, is that some delegates approached Kirov before or during the Congress to suggest that he should take over the position of General Secretary from Stalin. The testimony indicates that Kirov rejected these approaches and that he informed Stalin of what had been proposed. Whether this account is accurate in all its details, whether Kirov's rejection was as complete and as immediate as the testimony suggests, whether he communicated everything to Stalin or managed the information more carefully, are questions that the available evidence does not definitively resolve. What is documented is that the Congress produced a vote for the Central Committee in which Stalin received a significant number of negative votes, a number that was apparently manipulated downward in the official count, and that the evidence for this vote manipulation was known to the NKVD officials who managed the ballots. The documented evidence of dissatisfaction with Stalin's leadership at the Congress of Victors, however it was expressed and however carefully managed, was a political reality that existed in the context of the Soviet system's dynamics in 1934. It was the kind of information about the state of the party's confidence in its leadership that had specific significance in a system where the appearance of unanimous support was both politically essential and constantly managed. Kirov's popularity within the party, his genuine appeal to party members across the Soviet Union, his reputation for the specific combination of organizational effectiveness and personal accessibility that distinguished him from many of the more rigid and bureaucratic figures in the leadership, was real and was documented in multiple sources. He was genuinely liked in ways that most senior Soviet political figures were not. His speeches well received, his visits to factories and party organizations generating the kind of authentic enthusiasm that was different from the organized demonstrations of loyalty that the Stalin cult required. This popularity was, in the specific political logic of the Stalinist system, potentially dangerous. A leader who was genuinely popular within the party, who had demonstrated political ability across decades of revolutionary and governmental work, who had the Leningrad organizational base under his personal command, and about whom discussion of the top leadership position had apparently been raised, was a figure whose political significance could not be assessed simply in terms of his current institutional subordination. The specific question of whether Stalin understood Kirov's popularity as a threat is one that the available evidence approaches but does not answer conclusively. What is documented is that the relationship between them continued to appear warm and collegial through 1934, that Kirov traveled to Moscow and participated in Politburo proceedings, that the external surface of their relationship showed none of the tension that the underlying political dynamics might have created. The events of December 1st, 1934, begin with what is known and proceed quickly to what is contested. What is known is that Leonid Nikolaev, a 30-year-old former party member who had been expelled from the party in 1934 and who was in personal and financial difficulties, was in the Smolny Institute on December 1st with a revolver. What is known is that he shot Kirov in the back of the head as Kirov walked through the third-floor corridor. What is known is that Kirov died as a result of this wound. What is contested begins almost immediately. Nikolaev had been detained with a revolver near Kirov in October 1934 and had been released. The specific circumstances of this earlier detention and release have never been fully explained. The security arrangements at the Smolny on December 1st, specifically the circumstances under which Nikolaev was able to gain access and to be in the corridor at the relevant time, have been the subject of extensive historical investigation without fully satisfactory explanation. Kirov's personal bodyguard, Mikhail Borisov, was not with Kirov when the shooting occurred. Borisov's absence from his post at the moment of the assassination is one of the unexplained features of the events of December 1st, an absence that should not have occurred according to normal protective procedures, and that has never been satisfactorily explained in terms of innocent circumstances. The subsequent death of Borisov himself, killed on December 2nd in circumstances that were officially described as a traffic accident, removed from the investigation the person most likely to have direct knowledge of why the security arrangements on December 1st had failed. Borisov was being transported in an NKVD vehicle when the fatal incident occurred. The other people in the vehicle survived. Borisov was killed. The coincidence of Borisov's death, occurring the day after the assassination and removing a key witness to the security failures, is the single fact most frequently cited by historians who are skeptical of the official account of Kirov's murder as the act of a lone disgruntled former party member. It does not prove the alternative interpretation, but it is the kind of coincidence that a rigorous investigation would need to account for, and that the available documentation does not satisfactorily explain. Stalin arrived in Leningrad by train on December 2nd, the day after the assassination, accompanied by senior NKVD officials, including Yagoda. His personal involvement in the investigation from its very beginning was unusual and is itself significant. The General Secretary of the party did not typically travel personally to the sites of criminal investigations to supervise their conduct. His presence in Leningrad, taking control of the investigation process from the first day, placed him in direct oversight of how the investigation was being conducted, what evidence was being gathered, and how the case was being framed. His conduct during the investigation has been documented in the accounts of people present, and these accounts describe behavior that struck observers as unusual. He reportedly struck Nikolaev when Nikolaev was brought before him for questioning, a physical reaction that was noted by witnesses. The specific direction in which the investigation was steered, from the outset connecting Nikolaev's act to the former Zinovievite political network in Leningrad, and using this connection as the basis for a broader political prosecution, was a direction that served very specific political purposes. The investigation's rapid connection of Nikolaev to the broader alleged conspiracy involving former oppositionists was established within days of the assassination, with a speed that historians have noted is consistent with either a genuine investigation that quickly found evidence, or a politically directed investigation that was working toward a predetermined conclusion. The distinction between these two possibilities is one that the available evidence does not definitively establish. Nikolaev himself was interrogated extensively. The testimony he provided under interrogation implicated various people in the alleged conspiracy, naming members of what the investigation characterized as a Leningrad center of the Trotskyite Zinovievite conspiracy. Nikolaev was tried and executed in December 1934, along with 13 co-defendants who were alleged to have been part of the conspiracy. The speed of the trial and execution, conducted within weeks of the assassination, eliminated the primary witnesses to the investigation's conduct before any external examination of their testimony was possible. The new laws passed in the immediate aftermath of Kirov's assassination, providing for accelerated processing of terrorism cases without normal legal procedures and for immediate execution following conviction without right of appeal, were presented as a response to the security threat revealed by the assassination. They were also the legal framework that would be used for the mass executions of the Great Terror in 1937 and 1938. The legislation created in response to Kirov's murder was the operational legal basis for the terror that followed. The Leningrad NKVD officials who had been responsible for Kirov's security and who were therefore in a position to know what the security failures of December 1st had actually consisted of were arrested and tried in early 1935. They were convicted of criminal negligence in their failure to protect Kirov. Their subsequent fate varied, but they were removed from positions where they could continue to investigate or speak about the specific circumstances of the security failures that had allowed the assassination to occur. The subsequent use of Kirov's murder as the triggering justification for the successive waves of arrests and prosecutions that built toward the Great Terror was the most significant political consequence of the assassination. The Kirov murder provided the narrative framework that justified each successive expansion of the terror. The claim that a massive conspiracy of former oppositionists connected to foreign intelligence services had been plotting against the Soviet leadership, of which the Kirov assassination was the most visible expression, required the arrest and prosecution of everyone who had ever been associated with opposition to the party line. Zinoviev and Kamenev were arrested in January 1935 in connection with the Kirov murder investigation. They were not initially charged with direct organizational responsibility for the assassination, but the investigation established the alleged moral and political responsibility of the former Zinovievite network for the political atmosphere in which the assassination had occurred. This framework was the bridge from the specific murder to the broader terror, the mechanism by which a single killing justified the prosecution of thousands and eventually hundreds of thousands of people. The question of Stalin's involvement in Kirov's murder has been investigated multiple times within the Soviet and Russian systems, with results that reflect the political environment of each investigation more than the application of consistent evidentiary standards. The NKVD investigation of 1934 and 1935, conducted under Stalin's personal oversight, produced the narrative of a Trotskyite Zinovievite conspiracy that served the political purposes of the terror. It did not investigate the possibility that the security failures had been organized from within the NKVD itself. The 1956 investigation, conducted under Khrushchev's direction as part of the broader de-Stalinization process, examined the evidence more critically and produced findings that raised serious questions about the official account. Khrushchev's secret speech included references to the suspicious circumstances surrounding Kirov's murder, suggesting that Stalin bore responsibility for it, though stopping short of a definitive conclusion. The investigation of this period found evidence of the security failures and of the manipulation of the investigation, but did not produce documentary proof of Stalin's direct organizational involvement. The 1990 investigation, conducted in the final years of the Soviet Union, had access to archive materials that had not been available to earlier investigators and produced the most thorough examination of the evidence yet conducted. This investigation concluded that Nikolaev had acted alone, that he was a genuinely disgruntled individual motivated by personal grievances, and that the evidence did not establish Stalin's organizational involvement in the murder. This conclusion has been accepted by some historians and disputed by others. The dispute among historians about Stalin's involvement in Kirov's murder reflects the genuine evidentiary complexity of the case, rather than simply political disagreement about the interpretation of clear facts. The evidence that supports the lone gunman conclusion includes Nikolaev's documented personal grievances and his apparent individual motivation. The evidence that supports suspicion of Stalin's involvement includes the security failures, Borisov's death, the speed with which the investigation produced politically useful results, and the pattern of benefit that accrued to Stalin from the murder. The historical argument that circumstantial evidence of political benefit cannot substitute for direct evidence of organizational involvement is sound as a principle of historical method. Stalin benefited enormously from Kirov's death. The terror that followed could not have been launched in the same way without the assassination as its narrative foundation. But benefit is not proof of organization, and the direct documentary evidence of Stalin's involvement in planning the murder has not been found in the available archives. What can be said with confidence is that the investigation of Kirov's murder was conducted in ways that served political purposes rather than evidentiary ones, that evidence was managed and witnesses eliminated in ways that prevented a genuine forensic examination of what happened on December 1st, 1934, and that the political consequences of the murder were used immediately and comprehensively to advance an agenda of political repression that Stalin had both the motive and the institutional means to pursue. Whether Stalin arranged the murder or simply exploited it with extraordinary speed and comprehensiveness is the question that remains open. It is the most significant unanswered question in Soviet political history. Sergei Kirov himself is a figure whose historical assessment is complicated by the specific circumstances of his death and its aftermath. He was not a Democrat, not a liberal, not someone whose political program represented a genuine alternative to Stalinist authoritarianism. He was a committed Bolshevik who had served the Soviet system through all its phases, including the phases of extreme violence and mass repression that he oversaw in Leningrad as party secretary. But he was also, within the specific political culture of the Stalinist system, someone whose popularity and whose apparent willingness to express moderate positions on specific policy questions represented the kind of political independence that the logic of total control could not permanently accommodate. Whether his moderation was genuine or tactical, whether it represented a real alternative political vision or simply a different management style, is something that his early death makes impossible to determine. He was 48 years old when he was shot in the Smolny corridor. He had spent 30 years in revolutionary and political work. He had built one of the most effectively organized regional party structures in the Soviet Union. He had been one of the most genuinely popular figures in the Soviet leadership. And he died in a corridor, shot from behind, in circumstances that the century since has not been able to fully explain. The investigation was compromised from the beginning. The key witness died the following day in a traffic accident. The investigation was steered toward politically convenient conclusions. The defendants were processed and executed before independent examination was possible. The archive that might resolve the remaining questions has been available only partially and under politically managed conditions. What followed his death was the Great Terror, the most comprehensive political massacre in Soviet history, in which approximately 750,000 people were executed and 1.5 million were sent to labor camps in the years 1937 and 1938 alone. The terror that was launched in Kirov's name, using his murder as its founding justification, consumed people who had nothing to do with his death and who represented no genuine threat to anyone. It consumed eventually virtually all of the people who had known Kirov, worked with him, been associated with the Leningrad party organization he had built. The people who might have known things about the circumstances of his death, who might have had information about the security failures and their origins, were processed through the same terror that his death had triggered. The silence around Kirov's murder was not accidental. It was the product of the deliberate elimination of everyone who might have been able to speak credibly about what had actually happened in the Smolny corridor on December 1st, 1934. Stalin trusted him. He was shot one evening in a corridor. And then the killing really began. The full truth of what happened in Leningrad on December 1st, 1934, may be in an archive somewhere, in a document that has not yet been found or has not yet been released. Or it may be permanently beyond recovery, destroyed in one of the many instances in which the Soviet security apparatus removed from the documentary record the evidence of its own most sensitive operations. What is certain is that the death of Sergei Kirov changed the history of the Soviet Union in ways that cannot be reversed, that the terror it triggered consumed millions of lives, that the question of who was responsible for triggering that terror by arranging or enabling his murder remains, after nearly a century of investigation, unanswered with the definitiveness that the scale of the consequences would seem to demand. One shot in a corridor. The question of who fired it, in the fullest sense of that question, is still waiting for its complete answer.